Welcome to DANSOX Virtual Summer School. I'm Joseph Kay, or lecture number 4. And I'm going to be talking about relationships between musical notation and dance notation, movement notation in or as music. I first became interested in dance notation last year while I was learning Bach's C minor partita. I was trying to work out how to play the courante section when I realized that I had absolutely no idea what kind of a dance the courante is. And so, like any good researcher, I looked it up on Wikipedia. There I came across this image, the steps of a courante written in Beauchamp-Feuillet notation, and it amazed me. Now, even though I spent a lot of time during my doctorate researching the semiotics of notation in music, and although I have been very lucky to have worked with a lot of dancers, dance notation remained until that point at the periphery of my vision. This, I think, is illustrative of an absence of joined-up, cross-disciplinary thinking and practice when it comes to notation in music and notation in dance. Indeed, in studies of music notation, dance notation is hardly ever mentioned. In studies of dance notation, on the other hand, where it is mentioned, musical notation tends to be oversimplified in order that it can be used straightforwardly as a point of difference. I would like to bridge this gap with a point of similarity, with the basic premise that musical notation is in fact a notation of movement. This might seem a little odd, but what does musical notation tell its reader other than how to move? Since its origins in the early 11th century, musical notation has been nothing more than a series of instructions relating to the movement of the fingers, the lips, arms, lungs, even sometimes legs, for the purposes of creating expression. There isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that this was really how people thought about musical notation until around halfway through the last century, when certain composers began to turn away from the assumption that music was of the mind in a renewed recognition that it is, in fact, of the body. Interestingly, it was also at around this time that Laban notation was taking root, and Benesch movement notation came to fruition, but more of that later. In the first part of this talk, I will briefly discuss 2 early works by Helmut Lachenmann, one of the composers that sought to move music back to the body, and perhaps the composer whose innovations in notation have had the biggest impact on the music that followed. Tired of the Darmstadt Summer School's serial orthodoxy, Lachenmann developed in the 1960s the idea of musique concrète instrumentale. This was an approach to composition that was not so much concerned with the sounds themselves, but with the means of their production, the material and energetic conditions out of which sounds are formed, and the structural connections that arise between them. Through its intense scrutiny of these conditions, brought into the foreground through sonic deformation and the so-called denaturalization of conventional instrumental technique, musique concrète instrumentale sought to bring the awareness of its listeners to, and in so doing free them from, the predetermined conditions and structures of their listening. In Lachenmann's own words, while music making generally involves as discreet an effort as possible to make a tone sound in the desired manner, I would like to attempt to reverse this causal relationship, allowing the tone to sound in such a way as to reveal the underlying effort, both on the part of the player and of the instrument, so as to bring about an impression of the cause from the effect. I want to profane, to demusicalize whatever sound I might choose as a direct or indirect product of mechanical actions and operations, and thus to lay the foundations for a new understanding, sound as an acoustic record of a very specific amount of energy under very specific conditions. Given that musical notation, and probably all notation, relies on a number of conventions that are more or less collectively agreed upon. It is difficult to notate new sounds. What is more, Lackermann's radically new way of thinking about sound as a result of action needed a new way of writing sounds down more explicitly as actions that would result in sounds. We might call this new writing strategy a form of action notation, or perhaps prescriptive notation, one that indicates how a sound can be made to sound. This is opposed to descriptive notation, that functions as a record of what a sound sounded like. I find this distinction, which I think was first suggested by Charles Seeger in 1958, really helpful when thinking about different kinds of dance notation. One of Lackermann's early experiments with notating action was a piece for solo piano called Guero, written in 1969 and then revised in 1988. Here we can see a central line running horizontally along each staff that indicates the position of the piano's middle C, above and below which various movements of the hands over the surface of the keys and later on the tuning pins and strings are written as actions. Different symbols indicate the mode of contact between the fingers and the surface of the keys. An empty square, for instance, asks the performer to glide over the front surface of the keys using their thumbnail. A circle with a small dot within it asks for the nail of an extended finger to be drawn across the upper surface of the keys. The gradients of each line indicate the speed and, consequently, the dynamic of each movement. And the timing of the piece is shown by short vertical lines showing divisions of a second, rather like Eshkol-Wachmann's notation system. This means that, as in Laban notation, the duration of a movement is indicated by the length of the movement symbol. Here is a recording of an excerpt of the piece played, and I'm afraid not particularly faithfully, by the composer, which I've set alongside the score for reference. And so it continues. Another early example of this notation strategy is Pression for solo cello, also written in 1969. Whereas the surface of the piano's keyboard resembles a two-dimensional space, here Lackermann renders his notation into something more closely resembling three dimensions, introducing vertical movement into the lateral planes that we saw in Guerro. Like dance notation, Lackerman here attempts to capture something three-dimensional, or four if one is to include time, onto the flat land of the page. The system of timing is the same as that used in Guerro, but the score of Pression includes pictograms which function, admittedly rather rudimentarily, in a similar manner to those found in movement systems from Saint-Léon to Benesch. Here is an excerpt from Pression, again with the score, played and produced brilliantly by David Stromberg. What I think is so interesting about this notational approach is the way in which it draws attention to the act of reading as a form of mediation between the physicalities of the instrument and the physicalities of the body. Faced with an entirely new notational system, along with an entirely new set of techniques and all that that implies, the performer must take a step back to consider afresh the material nature of the relationship between instrument, hand, and eye that learned habits of reading conventionally overlook. Heidegger's theory of das Zeug comes in useful here. The idea that the sudden malfunction of a familiar tool brings about a keen awareness of that tool's presence at hand, its material qualities, its significant potential, and its position within a network of action. Like many systems of dance notation, Lackerman's notation not only indicates movement, but interrogates it as well. Although Lackerman moved quite quickly away from this notational strategy, a considerable number of composers have since taken up the gauntlet, with ever-increasing levels of stratification and usually of complexity. Recently, Aaron Cassidy, Simon Steen Andersen, Evan Johnson, Gerhard Winkler, and refreshingly, Elo Mazing, who in Planes uses the notational system given to the string quartet as a prompt for a dancer's improvisation. This chamber music for string quartet and dancer, she calls it, is valuable in its attempt to bridge the gap between musical notation and dance notation. But I find myself a bit frustrated by the discrepancy between the detail of the musician's notation and the lack of information given to the dancer. And I can't help but think that there is a trick missed here in the disconnection of the piece's material. Using these kinds of notation makes explicit the implicit fact that the parameters of a given, or indeed chosen, notation system are absolutely essential to the process of musical construction. I should stress here that this is only the case for music that is notated, which, after all, represents only a small part of the world's music. Anyway, Roman Haubenstock Ramati, a composer but also a designer and painter, put the point well, writing that during the compositional process, a reciprocal relationship develops between the idea, the thought, and the slowly evolving manner of writing it down. This relationship of continuous mutual influence lasts during the whole time of composition. This opens up a point of divergence between the practice of notating music and the practice of notating dance. The notation of music is intrinsic to the act of its composition, and thus it is intrinsic to the nature of the composition itself, and so too to the act of its interpretation. In short, musical notation, particularly of the kind that I have been discussing, happens before the fact, and is, in that sense, prescriptive. The act of notating dance, on the other hand, is not necessarily intrinsic to the choreographic process as done by the choreographer. Yes, a choreologist might be present during the process, but their function is less a reciprocal one than a mediating one. Dance notation must, therefore, usually be descriptive, although there are, of course, some exceptions, such as Remy Charlip's choreographic illustrations or Cunningham's use of chants. I must stress that in making this distinction, I don't mean to denigrate movement notation, but simply to point out that while musical and dance notation are both notations of movement, their respective focuses, or perhaps we might say the points at which they tend to be situated along the communicative timeline, are different. I am struck by the fact that at the same time as composers and scholars of music were turning more and more towards the body and to an appreciation of the mobility and contingency of musical meaning, there was an increasing tendency towards a kind of litericizing of dance. Through Laban and Benesch in particular, an accrual of a literature of dance in the 20th century became possible, perhaps motivated, as Victoria Watts, herself a dance notator, claims, by this perception that this was, quote, vital for dance in staking a claim to legitimacy as an art form and to gaining recognition as a discipline within an institution of higher learning. This literature is, however, uniquely unusual in that each of its constituent parts may well have been written and may continue to be written at many different times by many different authors. This leads to an important question. What is it exactly that constitutes a work of dance? Is it the choreographer's original intent? If so, how can we be sure of what that is or was? Is it the performance? If so, which performance? Is it in the score? If it is, do we need to ask questions about the reliability of the notator? And what exactly was being notated? Dance notation is a form of reification, but a reification of what exactly? Now, as a composer who is much more interested in collaborative practice than in telling people what to do, I don't see these questions as problems, but rather as exciting opportunities to celebrate the open, mobile, and non-linear potential of notation within the space of performance. So I came up with an idea that I was planning to workshop with two wonderful dancers and artists, Estella Merlos and Thomasin Gulgetch, as part of a residency at this year's summer school. Sadly, current circumstances have made this impossible, but I will finish this talk by giving an outline of what I hope could happen soon. In short, the idea is to read dance notation as if it were musical notation. When I first saw this image of the courante in Beauchamp-Feuillet notation, I just thought it was so beautiful. And although at first I had no idea what it was or what it could mean, it seemed so full of information. I began to wonder how this image could be read as a musical score. Now, I'm aware of a danger here. There is a risk of seeming to collapse a technical history into an aesthetic object, and in so doing to ignore the bodies that constitute that history. But done carefully, I believe that a musical approach to dance notation is one way to appreciate dance notations as texts of performative knowledge, as Claudia Jeschke puts it, to reinvigorate graphing, writing, as an action. And there is a heritage here also to this kind of reading. Consider Cornelius Cardew's Treatise, an 193-page musical composition written between 1963 and 1967, some pages of which I think look remarkably like an echo of Beauchamp-Feuillet notation. I haven't been able to find any evidence that Cardew was indeed thinking about dance notation at all while he was writing Treatise, but I still think there is something so dancily about his lines, perhaps because they are so evidently traces of movement, just as Beauchamp-Feuillet and other systems of track drawing were. It is important to point out that Cardew's piece is not intended to be a prompt for improvisation, but to be a prompt for discussion, study, and eventual consensus on how the piece or sections of it will be performed. A radical experiment in democracy, as philosopher of music Christopher Cox wrote. The similarity between Cardew's notation and Beauchamp-Feuillet is clearest if we flip the Beauchamp-Feuillet notation onto the horizontal. But musical notation, just as dance notation, needn't necessarily be read from left to right. Here is an example of clavar scribo, a notational system read vertically, just like Laban notation. It was introduced by Cornelis Potts in 1931 to facilitate the easier reading of keyboard writing. Its parsimony and quest for intuition also make me think of Nicolaius's choroscript. Another example worth looking at is Plus Minus by Stockhausen, who was incidentally Cardew's former boss. Written in 1963 and revised in 1974, Plus Minus consists of a series of boxed diagrams or events, 7 character types, central sounds, accessories, and subsidiary notes that grow or subtract, plus or minus. Again, this is not open notation, but is to be read and realized according to an incredibly intricate set of rules. I must admit that I find the complexity of plus minus a little dizzying, but looking through Anne Hutchinson Guest's choreographics, I practically did a double take when I saw how similar the effect of Stockhausen's score is to a floor pan for a contredanse allemande drawn up by Londrin in the mid-18th century. For entirely different purposes and at very different times, Londrin, as well as his contemporaries, and Stockhausen were using abstractions of a similarly high degree to indicate the disposition of characters on a virtual stage. Finally, it is worth mentioning musical scores that are not necessarily meant to, and perhaps cannot be, read linearly. The obvious example is December 1952 by Earl Brown, a piece to which John Cage and David Tudor were, quote, very unsympathetic, mistaking it for improvisation and so wary of the possibility of cliché. As it happens, Tudor did eventually make a realization of the piece, to which Cunningham made some choreography, possibly as part of Galaxy in 1956. Another less well-known piece, which is the image in my title slide, is Franco Donatoni's Babai, written in 1963 and then arranged for harpsichord in 1964. I include this partly because of its superficial, although still I think quite pleasing, resemblance to Laban notation, but mostly because the relationship between the non-linear original of Babai and the linearity of its later arrangement for harpsichord is a useful way of thinking about the mobility of notation in the project that I am proposing. So finally, the idea. To transcribe dance notations of different kinds into music, to realize them with the same disciplined, systematic approach that the scores that I have discussed call for, and to give these realizations to a dancer. Would it be that the resulting movement would in some way resemble the original notation? What would happen if a notator then notated this movement? What would happen if two notators notated it? This or these new notations could be transcribed into music again. This could be given to other dancers. New music could be written to these movements. There are numerous possibilities here to build a productive network of thought and practice between dance notation and musical notation, and to identify more clearly through their interactions the way in which the two overlap and may inform one another reciprocally. I should say that the original plan was to hold an open participatory workshop during the summer school to sound the waters on this idea. And I would still be extremely appreciative to hear your thoughts and your feedback virtually. This can be done by sending an email with the subject DANSOX to development.office@st-hilders.ox.ac.uk. The idea of feedback is, after all, intrinsic to this work. It is impossible to predict what might happen with this project until it starts to happen. So please do get in touch with your thoughts if you would like to, and please watch this space. In the meantime, I hope that I might have given a useful perspective on dance notation from a musician's point of view, or at the very least, recommended some interesting music that may be new to some of you. Thank you very much.